So, new series on God's Spirit, and the first of these, which is the power of God to create. And the first question that we want to seek to answer is, what is God's Spirit? And then we'll spend quite a bit of time in Genesis that we've read together, and think about how that's used, how God's Spirit is used in God's creative process. So if we just turn to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, we see here that we are introduced very early on in our Bibles to the idea of the Spirit of God, or the Spirit of the Elohim, as it is there in verse 2. The earth is without form and void, and darkness is upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And the Hebrew here for spirit is ruach. And because we have plenty of occasions where this word in the Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament, we have the New Testament equivalent, which is the Greek word pneuma. Except on one occasion, which is in Romans chapter 11. And we just turn to Romans chapter 11, because it's perhaps slightly indicative of what some of the sense of God's Spirit. Because we read in Romans 11, verse 34, "Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counsellor?" And we'll see from your margins that that is quoted from Isaiah 40, and everywhere else that I have been able to find where this word is translated, it's translated in the Greek pneuma, but here is this word mind, the mind of the Lord. And there are several different meanings or ways in which the Hebrew is translated, but at its essence, the idea of ruach is the idea of the wind, or the spirit, the breath of God. It comes from the root breath. And we can see why this word is translated here as mind, because there is a connection, isn't there, between the breath of God, which conveys his word and his power, and the mind, which is obviously the genesis of the words that God speaks. So who has known the mind of the Lord? Who has known the words generated by his mind? And there is an equivalence to be made with the English word inspiration in the two kind of aspects of the mind of something and the breath of something, because we are inspired, or we inspire and expire, or we inhale and we exhale, and that speaks about the physical process of breath going into us and coming out of us. We also know that inspiration, particularly in a biblical sense, is the idea of the Spirit of God working upon a man, that their mind might understand the mind of God, and that they might convey God's words, that they might be inspired by God. So there is an equivalence here which helps us to begin to understand what some of the aspects or the agency of the Spirit of God is about in our Bibles. And the other reason why Romans chapter 11 is an interesting verse to go to in thinking about the Spirit of God is because there is a sense in which the Spirit carries several different meanings in the Old Testament, or is translated in different ways, and that there is something which is slightly nuanced and slightly unknowable about the Spirit of God, certainly from a natural perspective. And this is the question that is posed here in Romans 11. Who has known the mind of the Lord? Who can understand the Spirit, the power of God? Who can understand and comprehend how it works and what it does? And that's the sense that's brought out in Romans and elsewhere, as we will see. And there is also an equivalent Old Testament concept which conveys a similar kind of transience to the Spirit of God, which is the idea of vanity. And if we go to Ecclesiastes in particular, we have almost a negative corresponding concept to the idea of the Spirit of God, or the breath of God, in the idea of vanity, because the Hebrew for vanity or vain, hebel or habal, again, has various nuanced translations and meanings, is my understanding. And it's in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 14 that we get these ideas being brought together. All is vanity and vexation of spirit, or vexation of the ruach, the grazing or the eating on the wind. And the difference is that this is talking about the vanity of man pursuing after, or things which are vain. Man's pursuit after things which are vain is like man pursuing the wind, the natural wind. And the natural wind is unknowable, and it's not tangible, is it, in some senses. But the Spirit of God is quite different from this. The spiritual equivalent is very different in that it's absolutely purposeful and powerful. There is something which is unknowable about it from man's natural mind, but it is the force and the power of God. And we can understand something of the Spirit of God and the power of God and how he works, as we will see in Genesis, but not with the natural thinking. And again, we might turn to passages such as 1 Corinthians chapter 2. The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. So the Spirit of God and how God works needs to be understood from his Spirit word. But what we might summarise, and there are different ways in which we can explore some of them this evening, God's Spirit works, is effectively that it is his agency. It is the way in which he conveys his power in creation. And this is, in Genesis chapter 1, conveyed through the Elohim, as we read that the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the Elohim, moved upon the face of the waters. So it is the enacting power of God. There is also something to be said about it being, as it were, a consolidation of God's presence. If we think about what God is, where we're told elsewhere that he is a presence that is everywhere, well, sometimes it is helpful perhaps for us as humans to have a sense of God's Spirit in a single place. And here, the idea of God of being in a single place, or being a being, conveying his essence, as it were. And here we have that described. The Spirit of God is located above the face of the waters. And it stands to reason, doesn't it, when we're thinking about some of the words in which some of the things that we've thought about, if this word means breath, and it's referred to the wind or the breath by the root of God, and it conveys his thoughts, and it conveys the power of his word, then that is where we would expect the presence of God to be. So here we have then the Spirit of God. And this Spirit of God then, in its interaction with man, is described as being able to relate to man in a number of different ways, which in a little while will become important. So if we were to turn to Exodus chapter 31, we see here that the Spirit can fill man. So it can go into man and it can fill him. Describing in Exodus 31, Bezaleel, God says in verse 3 that I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship to do the work of the creation of the different things within the tabernacle. So the Spirit of God can go into a man. It can also go above a man or cover a man. And in Numbers chapter 11 and verse 25, for instance, when the elders are selected to support Moses, the idea of the spirit power of God is described as something which has been resting upon or above Moses and then is conveyed to rest upon other people, the elders. So Yahweh came down in a cloud and spake unto him, and took of the spirit that was upon him, and gave it unto the 70 elders. And it came to pass, when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied and did not speak. Elsewhere in Isaiah 11 and verse 2, in a quotation, in a passage which speaks about the Lord Jesus Christ, it says that the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Yahweh. So there is another example of how the Spirit is described in its interaction with man, sometimes in and sometimes above. And a final example, which is a good example of the Spirit of God being in man, is the description in Ezekiel chapter 37 of God's Spirit going into the bones of the reconstituted Israel and bringing it to life. And we can see that there is obviously a direct comparison with Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 and the formation of man. So that the positioning of the Spirit is interesting, as we'll see in a moment. And what the Spirit of God does then is generally that it is a creative and a positive force, but not exclusively a creative force. And we see in Genesis chapter 1, actually the only time that we have this specific word ruach is in the account of creation, in both 1 and 2, is there in verse 2, that the Spirit of God moves upon the face of the waters. The words which are found in Genesis chapter 2 are different words for breath. And we'll think about that in a little while. But we know from other passages that it is the Spirit of God which has created all aspects of creation. So if we were to turn to Job chapter 26, for instance, and verse 13, we would read, "By his Spirit he hath garnished the heavens, his hand hath formed the crooked serpent," or, which is the word ruach. In Psalm 33, "By the word of Yahweh were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth." So it is, although it's not conveyed in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, it is the ruach, the Spirit of God, which is that creative force which works in the Elohim and which enables them to create all of creation. And there are just a couple of examples of where God's Spirit, his breath, destroys. So Job chapter 4 speaks about the breath of his nostrils destroying man. And Isaiah chapter 40, "The Spirit of the Lord bloweth upon the grass and the flower that fades." And we know as well that in a slightly different way, when God extracts his Spirit, his breath of life, then the thing dies that the Spirit was in. So God creates and sustains all of life through his Spirit power. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 1 then and have a little think about how God's Spirit is used in creation. I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of walking through the structure of Genesis chapter 1, because it's then in Genesis chapter 2, in those first few verses, that we really see then how the Spirit works in creating. And these are things that we're probably pretty familiar with. But we have at the beginning of Genesis chapter 1 then a couple of introductory verses. It's a summary, really, of what God is going to do in verse 1, and then the state in which we find creation before it is created. So in the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth. And then we read in verse 2, "This is the status, that the earth is without form and void, and darkness is upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moves upon the face of the waters. So we're told a few things then about what the earth is like. The earth is without form and it's void. Now, when we try and understand exactly what these words are, we'll turn to a couple of passages to seek to understand what these words are, talking about what is the earth before God comes and creates it. Well, it's without form. And the idea of form then, or that single word, if we turn to Isaiah chapter 41, doesn't seem to be the simplest word to really nail down what the idea of something being without form is. But in Isaiah 41 and verse 29, we see that there is a comparison that we can make with creation, with creating, and it says here in verse 28, I beheld, and there is no man, even among them, and there was no counsellor, that, when I asked of them, could answer a word. Behold, they are all vanity, their works are nothing, their molten images are wind, ruach, and confusion are void. And it's translated here as confusion. And what it seems to be saying is that there is something which is formless, as it were. That isn't the Hebrew word, but that's what it's conveying. And some of the different ways that this word is translated is that it's something which is chaotic, and something which is kind of chaotic and related here to wind is something that doesn't have a structure, doesn't have a form. Another good example to go to, just to slightly unpack this word a bit more, is Deuteronomy chapter 32. If we go to Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 10. Because here, again, we have two concepts or images which are taken from the Genesis record, this time applied to Jacob and his inheritance, as it's described in verse 9. It says that the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. God found him in a desert land and in the waste, formless, chaotic, howling wilderness. He led him about and he instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. As an eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, and spreadeth abroad her wings, he taketh them and beareth them on her wings. And as we'll see in a second, that word for fluttering over her young is the idea of the Spirit in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, hovering over the waters. So we get the two ideas being brought together here, the formless void, howling wilderness, and at the same time God comes and there is an energy to God in the way in which he comes and takes and saves Jacob here. So, but it's saying here it's a waste, howling wilderness. It's a chaotic wilderness. You can't build upon it. It's without structure. It's without form. And our final verse, if we just go back to Isaiah 45, which is perhaps the most helpful, Isaiah 45 and verse 18, where we read, For thus saith Yahweh, Isaiah 45 verse 18, that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord Yahweh, and there is none else. And that word vain there is the word formless. And this is perhaps the most helpful verse because we can see that what God has done is he's created it to be inhabited, and therefore the opposite of that is creating something in vain or formless, something that cannot be inhabited. It is uninhabitable. And if it's uninhabitable, it's formless. It's got no structure. There is no container, as it were, for something to go into. So the earth is without form and it is void. And if we turn, so that's the other word, void. And if we turn back a few chapters to Isaiah 34 and verse 11. Isaiah 34 and verse 11, we have a description here of some of the judgments that come upon Israel, and it says that the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it, the owl also and the raven shall dwell in it, and he shall stretch out upon it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness or voidness. They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all her princes shall be nothing, and thorns shall come up in her palaces, and nettles and brambles and fortresses. So the idea of void then is that there is nothing here. There is are these birds. And there are stones of emptiness. So there's no structure, it's without form, and it's void, it's empty. It's uninhabitable, and it's uninhabited. And finally, if we just go to Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23. It speaks here using the language of creation to describe some of the things which are brought against Israel. And we read there that I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, they had no light. And we read down, and the whole land, in verse 27, shall be made desolate, yet will I not make a full end. Verse 25, I behold, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. I behold, lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness. The cities thereof were broken down at the presence of Yahweh and by his fierce anger. So this is a desolate land. So we get a pretty good sense then from these passages what the earth is like in Genesis chapter 1. And we also have, if we go back to Genesis chapter 1, another phrase, the darkness is upon the face of the deep. And the idea here is perhaps a slightly kind of poetic, emphatic idea of the deepness of the earth, that there is nothing, there is just darkness upon the face of the deep. And the deep is not the same as the sea in Scripture, but there are often equivalences. So there is a specific sea which isn't made here, but the very depths of the earth, which sometimes is the very bottom of the sea, is this word which is used. And here is darkness. And this stands in contrast then, this formless, voidless, dark, deep, empty place, with the Spirit of God that is moving over the face of the waters. So there is this potential, there is this energy and this purpose, this presence of God. And we went to Deuteronomy 32, which spoke about the fluttering of the eagle over its nest. And this is the same idea here. It's this hovering, vibrating Spirit of God, which has this potential, which is about to unleash, as it were, creation upon this formless place. So there is this anticipation, and that's the summary of the first couple of verses. This is the status, the environment that God creates into. And so we have then the days of creation. And God says, let there be light, and there is light. And in the first 3 days of creation, we have the division of light and darkness, the division of the waters above and below the firmament, and the dividing of the water from land. It's gathered together and land emerges, and upon that land, then the land brings forth plants. And here, what we have is God establishing the containers for his creation. And these containers, as it were, or this structure, is all built around God dividing and the principle of separation. So God divides light and darkness, and there is just darkness, and then God creates light, and that separates these things. And there is a developing complexity and sophistication to the way in which God works and what is created. And there is also a very kind of structural way in which God is creating here. So fundamentally, light and darkness. God creates light. It's this very kind of binary sense of creation. Next, we get a vertical structure being imposed, with waters being separated in the heavens and the earth. And then we get a horizontal structure being created, with the earth, as it were, and the waters being separated. So there is this fantastic construction that God is making here in these first 3 days, which of course stands in direct contrast with the formless state of the earth. And then God moves in the next days to populate, to inhabit the structures that he has created. And we see this then in day 4, that he makes the lights which he sets in the firmaments. And the language there in the Hebrew conveys this. He sets the lights in the firmament of heaven. He's populating those things that he has created. There is also a sense in the creation that there is as it were, a process within a process being described here, because it's not as if there are just 3 components which are made on day 1, 2, and 3, and then they're populated in days 4, 5, and 6, because creation itself, the things that God creates on day 3, bring forth. So there is an extension of God's creation. God's creation itself begins to bring forth and to create. But God then populates the heavens with these 2 lights, and he populates heaven and the seas, and he populates the earth then with eventually with man. And so we get to the end of Genesis chapter 1, and we have the summary in verse 1 of chapter 2, which concludes and takes us back to verse 1, and that is the kind of the first section. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and now they're finished, except for verses 2 and 3, which provide an explanation of what God has done in finishing the heavens and the earth. So they were finished. How did God finish? Final conclusion to this first section. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all the work which God created and made. And there is quite a bit of overlapping structure in the Hebrew there. So God completes this creation. And then we begin a new section in verse 4, which is a second description of God's creation with quite a different focus. And we know that it's a different focus because of a couple of things. One is that we have an emphasis placed in verse 4 because it is chiastic. And the second is that we are introduced to another name of God, Yahweh. So previously it is the spirit of the Elohim, and now we are going to have this more intimate description of creation which focuses us upon this aspect of God who has a relationship with man, and so Yahweh God makes the earth and the heavens. But we notice in verse 4 that I'm not quite sure exactly what why we have this structure, what verse 4 is specifically trying to convey. So I'm interested in any thoughts. But we notice the inversion of the heavens and the earth and the heavens. And in the Hebrew, this is these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that they were made by Yahweh God, the earth and the heavens. So verse 4 structurally kind of sets us off on this new description of creation. And immediately we see that the description is, or the focus is quite different, because we zone in verse 5 on every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For Yahweh God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And Yahweh God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So here we see in verse 5 something of the interdependency of creation, or the dependency of creation, which we began to understand. Well, we do understand quite clearly from chapter 1. We've got the structure, the form, and it's populated. There is a dependency there. You can't have the second half without the first half. And verse 5 speaks about the dependency that creation has upon itself, but gives us different examples. Because it says every plant of the field before it's in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, it needs rain, and there needs to be a man. And we've learnt in chapter 1 that, well, man is going to exist from the herbs. So man relies upon the herbs of the field, but also man is there to nurture and to work in those fields as we go on to learn. And what else do those herbs need? Well, they need the rain. And so what does God do? Well, he creates that in verse 6. So there isn't water, so there is mist from the earth that waters the whole face of the ground. There isn't man, and so God forms man. So we can see in these few verses then that it continues to describe for us the dependency that and the structure of creation, but here there is a different focus. And just as we saw there is that counter to the formless, voidless earth that was described in chapter 1 with the forming and then the filling, here it is the same in the specific creation of man. Yahweh God forms man from the dust of the ground, and then he breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and man becomes a living soul. So here then we see that the creation of man follows the process of God's creation. First man is formed, and then he is imbued with this life-giving spirit. Although what we see in verse 7 is that there isn't the word ruach here. It isn't the Spirit of God. It is different Hebrew words for the breath of God, which is different from the breath of life. And it's almost as if there are all these different aspects emphasizing the importance of the breath of God in creating man. And we have to wait a little while before we see that it is the ruach which is used here that is breathed into man and that becomes and that it is that forms man. But before we look at that, let's just kind of step through this process. So the Lord God forms man of the dust of the ground. And we already know that God has constructed man, and it's been described in a slightly different way in chapter 1. Man has been made in the image of the Elohim. And the idea of the image there is is linked to, in other places in our scriptures, the idea of taking an image and then forming it into something. And we can understand the process that God goes through, combining Genesis 1 and 2, by thinking very simply about some of the other ways in which these words are used when man takes an image of an idol and then forms it into an idol. And these are the Hebrew words which are commonplace and which are used to describe these things. So Ezekiel 16 verse 17, for instance, it speaks of the creation, the formation of idols when they made the image of a man. They take the silver and the gold and they made the image of a man in Ezekiel 16. So just as man makes an idol then, God here has taken the image and now he's been made in the image, but how he makes that image, the next step in that process, having got an image, is described in verse 7. It's the formation of the raw materials to create that image. And this idea of forming then of man, we learn from passages such as Amos chapter 4, is also the same physical process that God uses to form the rest of his creation. It says, it's the same word that is used. He forms man, and it says, he that formeth the mountains in Amos chapter 4 and verse 13. Yahweh the God of hosts is his name. So the same way in which man is formed and compacted, so God creates the rest of creation, but we just weren't told that in chapter 1. And that seems to be appropriate because we have this almost more intimate account of creation here, where although we know that God used his spirit and he formed the rest of the creation in the same way, that is held exclusively in the Genesis account to describe the formation of man. God forms from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. And the idea, if we just go to Habakkuk in chapter 2. Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 18. Just an interesting passage just to emphasize what we're talking about, and then the difference, which kind of leads us into the next stage, where we read in verse 18, what profiteth the graven image that the maker thereof hath graven it, the molten image and the teacher of lies, that the maker of his work, the former of his form, trusteth therein to make dumb idols. Woe unto him that saith to the wood, awake, and to the dumb stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in the midst of it. So that stands as a nice verse to kind of hold against then the creation of man, the difference between what man creates and what God creates. But there is an equivalence, as we're explaining, between man creating images and idols and God creating man. But that equivalence is almost literal. It's not just symbolic, because we know, for instance, that God is described as a potter. So as a man takes the clay and creates a potter, a pot, a form of something, a container or an image, an idol, so God literally took the earth, the dust, which in Job chapter 4 and verse 19, there is an equivalence between clay and dust. So we get a very literal sense in which God is, as a potter, creating man. He's literally formed the dust into a vessel to put his spirit into it. And that is what then he does next in Genesis chapter 2. He breathes into man. He blows into man this breath of life, right into Adam's face, into his nostrils. And it's a very intimate experience, which is described exclusively, as we've said, of man, but the same breath goes into all the animals. As we know, let's just turn to Genesis chapter 7 and verse 22 as an example, where we have the same image conveyed to us of all creation, all in whose nostrils is the breath of life. So we know that it's entered into their nostrils, and they have now that breath of life, which is breathing, but it's only described that way for man. And Job chapter 27, we could turn to that and read all the while my breath is in me, the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. So that is a passage which tells us then, because that is the Ruach, that even though the word is not being used in chapter 2, it is the Spirit of God that is entering into the nostrils of man. This is the power of God, this life-giving force. So we can see here then that man is created, and he's described in the same way as creation. It follows the same process, that God has created this form and he's filled it with his Spirit. He's filled it with his breath, with this life.